Welcome to the 2024, is this on? Okay, cool. Welcome to the 2024 Scholars Day keynote address made possible by ESL Charitable Foundation and generous supporters of the Monroe Community College Foundation. We are pleased to welcome you to Monroe Community College this evening. We are especially honored to welcome our visiting scholar, David Wallace-Wells. My name is Joseph Leichner, and it gives me great pleasure to stand before you today as a business major student at MCC, a proud member of Phi Theta Kappa, and a strong believer that research is the key to improving our society. I am honored to be in the company of so many inspiring scholars who have demonstrated their excellence through their research projects. Participating in Scholars Day has given me the confidence to continue my research journey, believe in my potential to become successful in business or law, and even inspire other students to pursue their own research goals. Being part of Scholars Day has many rewards for all of us. Valuable experience that will aid in advancing our educational journey. Additionally, Scholars Day provides a chance to receive scholarships through MCC Foundation, which can support our academic plans and aspirations. Thank you, MCC Foundation, for believing in us. Somebody else who sincerely believes in the potential of MCC students is Dr. Michael Jacobs, Acting Provost and Vice President of Student and Academic Affairs. Dr. Jacobs served as MCC's Dean of Liberal Arts and Business for 7 years. Early in his tenure at the college, he founded MCC's Institute for the Humanities, which he directed until his transition to executive leadership early this month. Scholars Day is important to his vision at MCC. My fellow students and I have him, MCC President Dr. Bert Nana, and our professors to thank for an excellent academic experience. Please help us welcome Dr. Jacobs to the stage.
Thank you all. One of the really cool things about being in this acting position. I thought you were going to hang out for a little bit. No? Okay. Bye. Yeah, perfect. Where was I? Okay. So one of the cool things about being in this acting position this last month is I've been getting invited to a lot more of these celebrations of our high-achieving students. I guess one of the downsides of that is that these high-achieving students have to see and hear me over and over again, and I have to keep writing something new so they don't become repetitive, so bear with me. This might not be my best stuff. Students, faculty, staff, Scholars Day committee members, and esteemed guests, welcome to the 16th Annual Scholars Day Keynote Address. I extend my heartfelt congratulations to each of you for your achievements and contributions to this important event. Scholars Day at MCC is not just a conference. It is a celebration of academic excellence, a platform for showcasing, the consequential outcomes of undergraduate research, and a testament to the dedication of our faculty and staff in nurturing the intellectual curiosity and critical engagement of our scholars. Before saying anything else, I want to echo the sentiments we have heard throughout the last 2 days and recognize the particular contribution of Associate Professor Emeritus of Philosophy, Matt Hashey, who sadly passed away last year. Matt was one of the architects of this incredible event, and so we dedicate this year's Scholars Day to him. You know, amid a rather dubious national discourse that as of late seeks to question the value of higher education, often taking a painfully reductive stance on the role of community colleges in this paradigm, we here, through Scholars Day, push back on such a flawed narrative, demonstrating that our commitment to fostering a culture of scholarship and innovation, much to the benefit of our campus, regional, and global communities, is what we're all about. Scholars Day is a space for us to celebrate collectively the intellectual curiosity and ingenuity that thrives within our community. For a sizable number of students, the opportunity to collaborate with faculty on research projects at the beginning of their journey through higher learning yields essential exposure to a variety of degree programs, fields of study, and research methods across academic disciplines. And this kind of discovery is a central part of our mission, our vision, and our values. So to our talented students, I applaud not only your commitment to academic excellence and scholarly inquiry, but also the ways in which you continue to inspire us all. To our faculty and staff members, your support, guidance, and mentorship are imperative to making Scholars Day a resounding success and play a significant role in nurturing the intellectual, professional, and personal pursuits of our student scholars. Now, of course, this day would not be possible without the tireless work of the cross-disciplinary and cross-divisional committee of faculty and staff who designed and coordinated the event. Nor would these 2 days be a reality without the generous support of the MCC Foundation and our sponsors, the ESL Charitable Foundation, WXXI, and MCC's Office of Student Life and Leadership Development. On that note, it is my distinct honor to introduce John Paul Perez, Executive Director of the ESL Charitable Foundation. John Paul joined ESL in 2023, bringing more than 25 years of nonprofit management experience with him. Much of his work in this area has been focused on uplifting the community. As Executive Director, John Paul is responsible for the operational management of the ESL Charitable Foundation and the ESL Community Impact Team of Relationship Managers. In his work, he assists with the strategic philanthropic investment that strengthens our community. In his personal time, John Paul enjoys riding his motorcycle, capturing picturesque moments with his camera, traveling to new places, and creating memories with his wife and 2 children. Everyone in attendance, please join me in giving John Paul a warm welcome.
Thank you so much. I should have recorded that and just bring that with me everywhere I go, so I appreciate that. On behalf of the ESL, it is indeed a pleasure and an honor to once again be the presenting sponsor of Scholars Day at MCC. We celebrate the work students prepared and showcased here today and the important milestone their participation represents in their journey, and educational journey. We extend our most sincere appreciation and accolades to the students, faculty, staff, and administrators who make Scholars Day at MCC an extraordinary success. Additionally, it's a true pleasure to have the opportunity today to introduce you to David Wallace-Wells. Let me tell you a little bit about him. Wallace-Wells is currently a columnist and staff writer at the New York Times, where he writes a weekly newsletter on climate change, technology, and the future of this small thing called our planet. He has also written widely on the COVID-19 pandemic, bringing vital reporting and analysis to the science and policy coverage. He was previously the deputy editor at New York Magazine, where he wrote a column on climate change, and where his viral cover story, The Uninhabitable Earth, was met with widespread acclaim, paving the way for this book, which he'll talk about tonight. Wallace-Wells released his New York Times best-selling book, The Uninhabitable Earth, Life After Warming, in 2019, and it quickly received numerous accolades, as it should. The book has been ranked as a New York Times 100 Notable Books of 2019, GQ Best Books of 2019, The New Yorker's Favorite Books of 2019, and was one of Time's 100 Most Read Books of 2019. You crushed it, my friends. Tonight, we will have the opportunity to hear from Wallace-Wells as he draws on findings in his book. Please join me in welcoming David Wallace-Wells.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction. It's really great to be here in Rochester. It's really great to be here at MCC. And I have to say, above all, it's really great to be here on Scholars Day, celebrating all of the students and their work. It's also been amazing and inspiring to hear about the legacy of Matt Hashey, and I'm just kind of proud and humbled to be here on that occasion. I'm going to talk about, mostly about climate change. But before I get into that, I just want to say, I'm going to get into some scientific stuff. I'm going to get into some details, and I hope at the end of the talk we can have a Q&A and speak at some length about how you all think about this and what's on your mind about it. But before I get into those details, I just want to point out that this is, among other things, a representative test that we are all living through for how we treat one another, how we care for the planet that gave rise to us, and how well we take care of it and preserve it for future generations. So climate change has to do with energy, and it has to do with transportation, it has to do with agriculture and industry, it has to do with all the things that we've grown to associate this challenge with. But it's ultimately also a human story, a political story, a social story, a cultural story, an emotional story, which is going to reveal the meaning of what it means to be alive on this planet right now, and the legacy that all of us alive today will be leaving to our children and grandchildren going forward. And in that way, it's not just a scientific story, it's not just a moral story. It is really, truly the story of our time. And I think the more of us appreciate that, and the more that we all appreciate that, the more we can be motivated by its lessons, not just to take action on climate, but to really attend to those in need, to those suffering, and to do what we can to make sure that the future can be, at least relatively speaking, a happier, brighter, more just, more equitable place. When I am in an audience like this, in an auditorium like this, talking about climate change, I'm often there as a kind of a bad news guy. I mean, my book is called The Uninhabitable Earth. I like to point out the subtitle is Life After Warming. It's not, but nevertheless, my work has been alarm-raising work, and a lot of people have been raised to action by it, motivated to action by it, in part because I think the scenarios that science tells us to expect if we don't move quickly are quite scary. And I'll get to that stuff in a minute, but I actually wanted to start tonight by talking on another note, which is an optimistic note. And I wanted to do that for a number of reasons, but mostly because we're here in a community of young, publicly engaged, outwardly engaged scholars who are thinking about their own role in the world and what they can do to shape it. Oftentimes in thinking about climate change, all of us, whether we're 18, 28, 78, 88, whether we're Americans, whether we're Bangladeshis, whatever, we think about this challenge, it seems so large. It's a challenge the size of the planet and the size of human industrial civilization. And almost all of human history hangs on how we resolve it. It's such a large challenge that it can be hard to see the movement and the change. It can be hard to mark progress even when we make it. The scale of the problem seems so large, even those small amounts of incremental progress seem trivial by comparison. And sometimes it's even trickier to make an assessment of that progress when you're younger, since your own experience, which is relatively short, can sort of telescope your understanding of the recent past so that it looks almost like a permanent state of affairs, an unchanging state of affairs, and simultaneously make you feel that because you haven't yourself yet been a part of any great dramatic change, that therefore there hasn't been any or can't be any. And I think that's wrong to think that not just on a strategic level, it's wrong to think that not just in a moral sense, but it's also wrong given the history that we've lived through, even just the recent history that we've lived through. And I want to make that point just by taking a quick step back. I finished the manuscript of my book in the fall of 2018, which wasn't that long ago, about 5.5 years ago, just in the middle of the last presidential term. And at that time, it felt reasonable to say, as I did then, that while politics offered the only obvious path to a stable climate, people had been raising alarm about climate change for decades, and very little had changed. It wasn't quite true to say that we hadn't done anything or we weren't doing anything, but it was sort of true enough. You could look at UN projections for the 21st century in which Carbon emissions continued upward, and warming grew right in line with them, producing a lot of human suffering along the way, and think, maybe we won't be that bad. Maybe those emissions trajectories won't continue straight up. But also, it didn't look like an impossible course. We couldn't just discount out of hand the possibility that that would be how we would continue, because it was the course that we were on and had been on for the entire history of human industrial civilization. And that was just 5 years ago. I hadn't even heard of Greta Thunberg then. No one had. She had just started striking outside of Swedish parliament, a lonely, friendless teenager with a single sign all by herself. A few years later, she's so much the icon of a truly global political movement that she's almost sort of receded from the spotlight and let other activists take the stage. I hadn't heard of Extinction Rebellion, the activist group in the UK, or its successor group, Just Stop Oil. I hadn't heard of the Sunrise Movement in the US, or its successor group, Climate Defiance. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez hadn't yet been elected to Congress, let alone even begun talking about a Green New Deal. In the EU, they hadn't begun talking about their own version, which they called the European Green Deal, or Fit for 55. And back then, with only a few exceptions, hardly anyone wielding power anywhere in the world was actually talking about eliminating emissions. They were just talking about, not all of them, just some of them, they were just talking about reducing emissions, just 5 years ago. Back then, many in those positions of power were still engaged in campaigns of denial, not even bothering to pay lip service to the urgency of the climate crisis. Back then, in much of the scientific literature, we were still using the phrase business as usual to describe an emissions scenario with an estimated level of warming of about 4 degrees Celsius. And for those who aren't familiar with that scale, it's something like 3 to 4 times the amount of warming that we've had to this point. That's what we thought business as usual looked like, 4 degrees, 4 times what we're dealing with now. And now, just a few years later, on all of these fronts, the whole world honestly looks different. Today, business as usual, most scientists would tell you, is between 2 and 3 degrees, which means we've almost cut in half our expected warming in just a half decade. Of course, we've only cut it in half. We haven't gotten it all the way to stop. We're still going to be seeing considerably more warming and considerably more damage from here. But based on where we thought we were headed 5 years ago, we've made a remarkable amount of progress. There's been a global political awakening around climate change, with the climate strikers and climate protests that's filtered all the way up to presidents and prime ministers and out into the corporate world with CEOs and CFOs. Increasingly, the world as a whole is concerned about extreme weather and what it means for our future on the planet. And that is in part the result of protests which were led, I think it's really important to emphasize, in particular in a place like this, by young people. I mentioned Greta earlier, but although she's in certain ways the most famous of these protesters, she's also a kind of an outlier. She's a white girl from Sweden, rich country, but that is not the story of the climate strikers and the climate awakening of the last 5 years, her story. These are protests that were led all around the world by people who are as far from political power as you could possibly imagine. If I'm a 41-year-old, straight white man I write for the New York Times, I feel close to some access to political power. If I feel like the climate change challenge is so big and intimidating, how must it feel for a queer 15-year-old ethnic minority in South Asia? Or somebody who, even when they turn 18 in sub-Saharan Africa, won't have the right to vote? And that is the story of the climate strikers. These are people who are as far from political power as you could possibly imagine. Almost all women, young women, many of them queer, in countries, many of them that are not democratic, and all of them underage, who looked at the same logic and the same scale of the problem that I saw and probably many of you in the room saw and felt intimidated by. And they said, no, we are not going to accept the logic that tells us the problem is too big and power is too far from us. We are going to make our voices heard through protest and organizing and make sure that those in power change their ways as a result. And then they did that. In the space of a year, or 2 years from the farthest corners of the earth, like poorest, least empowered countries, people who are not empowered in those countries, insisted that their view of the climate future be reckoned with by those who are sitting in Davos or at the UN or in Washington, D.C. And it happened. Those climate protesters, those climate strikers, have changed the trajectory of global climate change and changed the shape of our expected future themselves. It's not just about them. Yeah, for real. It's not just about them. There's a lot of other stuff going on. But if we had not had the climate protests and the climate strikes over the last 5 years, we simply would not have had the climate politics that we now live in today, which aren't perfect. We're still falling far short, but which bring us or showcase a path to the future that is relatively manageable compared to the future we thought we were heading for just 5 years ago. I just want to run through a few other things that have changed outside of politics, although I think that that politics part is really paramount. The age of climate denial has now ended. There's nobody in power anywhere in the world who doesn't accept the reality of climate change. They may not want to do much about it. They may not want to invest in it. They may not think it's a big deal. All of those are problems. But 5 years ago, you had presidents and prime ministers in many countries in the world, and certainly a lot of people in the business community, who literally would tell you there was nothing going on. That's no longer the case. And this signals, in a certain way, a major sea change in the way that economists also see the challenge of decarbonization. For a long time, we thought that tackling climate change, dealing with it, would be expensive and burdensome. It might be necessary, it might be the moral thing to do, but it was going to be expensive and difficult. And because there's been an incredible sea change in the economics of renewable energy, where the price of wind and solar has fallen by something like 90% over the last decade, most economists will now tell you that the world will be better off, more prosperous, the faster we move, rather than the slower we move. And that's shaking up and changing the way that politicians see their jobs here too. Today, now more than 90% of the world's population lives in places where green energy is cheaper than dirty energy. And something like 50% of the world's population lives in places where new clean energy is cheaper than continuing to run the old fossil fuel plants. That means that anybody who's like drawing the future of the planet on a whiteboard and saying, what should we do? Where should we go? Every one of them, looking squarely at the facts, would say, we need to move greener, faster. That's really different than the world that we were living in just 5 years ago when we signed the Paris Accords. For a few years now, as a result, there's been more global investment in clean energy than dirty energy, and the margins are growing. These days, across much of the rich world, clean energy is producing 80 or 90% of new energy demand. These are really incredible achievements, and they were more or less unthinkable just a few years ago. But where does that land us? We've had a global climate awakening, we've had the end of climate denial, we've had unthinkable levels of investment, and we can see clearly the economic opportunities of a green transition and take seriously the climate justice implications of slower movement. And yet, the planet's still warming. In fact, it's warming faster every year than the year before. We are still setting new records each year for carbon emissions. That means every year we are doing more damage to the planet's climate future than we have ever done, ever before, in the entire history of humanity. Maybe in the next few years, we're going to reach a peak and start to decline, or I think more likely, a plateau. But even if we reach a peak, that only means the job is half done. It took us hundreds of years to get from no carbon emissions to the peak we're at now, and we're now going to try to get all the way to zero in a couple of decades. If we do reach a peak, and if 2025 we produce less carbon than we did in 2024, 2023, all that means is that we will have produced more carbon that year than every other year in human history but one or two. That's what it will mean to have reached a peak. Today, the planet's about, depending on the data set that you want to use, 1.1 to 1.3 degrees warmer than it was before the Industrial Revolution. Over the last year, it's actually been like 1.6 or 1.7, but scientists take a 30-year average to sort of flatten out all the variability. 1.1 degrees doesn't sound like very much, but it already puts us outside the window of temperatures that enclose all of human history. So the planet is already now today warmer than it has ever been when humans were around to walk on it. And that means that a huge amount of what we take for granted as human civilization is actually the result of climate conditions which we have already left behind. And part of the work of this next generation is to figure out what of that civilization can survive these new conditions, what will have to be renovated and reformed, and what will have to be discarded and abandoned. And I don't just mean concrete infrastructure or what kind of crops we grow. I also mean the way that we organize ourselves politically and socially to protect against a much more jagged climate future. We used to think of this story as a story of generations, that our grandparents or great-grandparents started burning coal, and now it was up to us to do some work so that our grandchildren or great-grandchildren wouldn't be struggling under the impacts of warming. In a certain way, that's true, but it's also the case that more than half of all of the carbon emissions that have ever been put up into the atmosphere through human activity have come in the last 25 years. And that's since Al Gore published his first book on warming, it's since the UN established its climate change body, it's since the premiere of Friends. It means we've done more damage knowingly in those 25 years than we ever managed in ignorance. And we now have about that much time, 25 years or so, to really take control, to stabilize and reduce our emissions and stabilize the planet's climate future. So I'm 41 years old. My life actually contains that entire first story, where we went from climate stability to the brink of catastrophe. And it will also almost certainly involve and enclose that second story, what we do about it and what kind of future we build for ourselves in spite of these changes. And that is an incredibly dizzying position to be in, which is the position that all of us are in, to be alive at this moment on this planet with the responsibility of its future in our hands. It's the kind of story, it's a kind of a superhero story. It's a kind of mythological story. It's even a kind of theological story. One generation tasked with the job of securing the planet's climate future and the future of human history. And while that's, again, an overwhelming feeling, I think it is also an empowering feeling because we are in control of that story. Too much damage has been done to this point, but what the future looks like is ultimately up to us and the choices that we make from here. And that will always be the case. Even at much higher levels of warming, we will always have the opportunity in any generation to take action, to bend the needle and bend the curve downward, prevent some additional human suffering that we would have otherwise had. So how different is the world today at 1.1 degrees? There are many ways of clocking the changes, and probably any number of you could call out events of even just the last year that have been shocking or horrifying as reminders of just how different the world is already. We had the deadliest wildfires in North America in a century in Maui last summer. More than 100 people died. There were people diving into the ocean. The flames were jumping over their heads to light on fire the boats that were floating in Lahaina Harbor. We had the deadliest fires in a century in South America, too, in Chile, where also more than 100 people died as fires tore through some towns outside of Valparaiso. We had fires in Canada that were so intense, so large, that you could fit half the world's countries inside the burn scar that burned in Canada just last year. This past summer in Acapulco, we had a completely anodyne, quotidian tropical storm develop into a Category 5 hurricane in just over 24 hours, which means that town, Acapulco, had no time to prepare or even to evacuate. We had a flood in Libya, which was the deadliest flood this century. And people who like to downplay the effects of warming will say, it wasn't just climate change, it was a dam that burst, the dam could have been repaired, political action could have secured the stability of that infrastructure, and we need to lay the blame and the bill for that damage and those many hundreds of deaths at those politicians who failed to secure the dam. But the storm that overran the dam, that storm was made 50% more intense by climate change and 50% more likely, which is all a lesson, I think, about how we think about this climate future. Yes, all of these impacts are complicated, and yes, they are all also about how humans design our response to these impacts. That is absolutely true. But the impacts are getting larger and more erratic and less predictable, and we are not proving ourselves very good at protecting one another, caring for one another, and projecting a future that allows us or inspires us to move more quickly. So that's all, those are ways that you can clock the differences in the world. But I like to think of it I think of it most often with the example of the city of Houston, which was hit recently with 5 what were called 500-year storms in just 5 years. And that term, 500-year storm, it was never all that scientifically legitimate, but it reminds us just at a vernacular level how far from the climate norm we already are. These are storms we would expect to hit once every 500 years. Now, 500 years ago, there were no Europeans in North America. Hernando Cortez had just recently landed in Mexico. So we're talking about a storm that we would expect to hit once during that entire history. The arrival of Europeans in North America, the waging of a genocide against the native people, the building of colonies, the building of a slave empire, the fighting of a revolution, the fighting of a civil war, industrialization, World War I, World War II, the age of American empire and the Cold War, the end of the Cold War, September 11th, the great financial crisis, COVID-19, one storm in all that time. And Houston's been hit by 5 of them in the last 5 years. They've literally dealt with millennia of extreme weather compressed into half a decade. Now, Houston's still standing, as is most of Canada and much of Maui. You go around the world, you look at these disasters, they're not wiping us off the map, which is just a reminder that climate change is not the whole of our destiny, as dramatic as the impacts may seem, but the natural landscape on which we will build our future, and indeed contest our future, fight for our future, sometimes against forces that don't want to see us succeed. That future will be unprecedented, but I also think it's important to keep in mind that as we live through it, probably it'll also feel somewhat normal, in the same way that all of us in this room, we probably read stories about the Maui fires, we probably read stories about the Chile fires, we probably read stories about the Canadian fires, we probably read stories about all this stuff, but we also went about our day and went about our lives. And that's likely to be the way that we navigate the climate future too, full of more human suffering, more disaster, but also full of humans living their lives, navigating that future for themselves. And the job for all of us as people who are engaged in trying to produce a happier, more stable, more equitable, more just future is to figure out ways, design ways through engineering, through our politics, through our social lives, to make that future somewhat more stable and somewhat more comfortable for those around us, rather than turning our backs on one another as we so often seem to do these days. So where are we heading from here? I mentioned earlier that we're at about 1.3 degrees of warming, maybe 1.1, depending on how you want to count. I think business as usual is talked about, somewhere between 2 and 3 degrees. Probably staying below 2 degrees is unlikely, although maybe it's possible. And just that amount of additional warming from about 1.1 to about 2 would mean 150 million additional people would die prematurely from the air pollution produced by the burning of fossil fuels. It would mean that in many parts of the world, what were once understood as once-a-century flooding events would happen every year. Across much of South Asia and the Middle East, we would have long stretches of the summer where it wouldn't be safe to go around outside without risking heat stroke. or even heat death. And increasingly, even now, we're seeing mass mortality events in richer parts of the world too, not just in the equatorial bands of the planet, which are hottest. Last summer in the UK, 60,000 people died because of the extreme heat. Which means we're also learning a bit about how simplistic it may have been for us to think that wealth was a protection against heat, and indeed that wealth would be a protection against all of these climate impacts. And while there's an enormous amount of debate about how to calculate the ultimate economic impact of all this disruption, a paper published a few weeks ago in Nature put it this way. No matter what emissions pathway we take from here, so no matter what we do, even if we decarbonize as absolutely rapidly as we possibly could, the warming we have already made inevitable, just from the carbon we've put up in the atmosphere already, is likely to reduce global incomes by 2050 by 19%. That means annual economic damages amounting to $38 trillion. And when we tabulate climate damages in dollars, it's pretty misleading because the value of property in India is not equal to the value of property in New York. And the value of a life in Bangladesh is not equal to the value of a life in Germany. It's grotesque to say, but that's how these numbers are calculated. And what that means is when economists study climate change and tell us tabulate global economic damages, they are sometimes telling us that something like a 50% reduction in Indian GDP, which affects 1.4 billion people, combined with a 5% increase in American GDP, would be a moral wash. And we know that that's grotesque, which is another reason to pay attention to climate change and the way that it's wreaking havoc all around the world, not just in our backyards. So that figure I just mentioned from this paper in Nature, $38 trillion of damage by 2050, that's just from the damage that's been made inevitable by the carbon we've already put into the atmosphere. It seems like a huge amount, right? But that's because we've put a huge amount of carbon up there. We can actually measure it. We can measure it by weight. And we've put more carbon into the atmosphere by weight than the weight of everything we have ever built on the planet. We've transformed our atmosphere more through carbon emissions than we've transformed literally the surface of the planet with all of our buildings and all of our highways and all of our airports, all of our homes and all of our farms. We've changed the atmosphere more by weight than all of that. In fact, the carbon up there weighs more than all living things on Earth. And it's going to stay up there for centuries, maybe millennia, depending on how, we think of carbon as a gas, it dissipates, but it actually doesn't dissipate. It stays up there for a very long time, which means not only is it the largest monument to human civilization we've ever managed, larger than all the other monuments put together, but it's also going to outlast everything that we've built on this planet. And it's cooking us. But it's not cooking us equally. I mentioned some of the distributional effects a minute ago, and I think that this is something it's really important for American audiences to focus on. All that carbon in the atmosphere, the US produced between 20 and 25% of it. That's about twice as much as the second biggest nation, second most responsible nation, China. It's also about 20 times as much as all of sub-Saharan Africa, which is home to more than 1 billion people. We've done 20 times as much damage as those billion people. The average American refrigerator uses more carbon today as the average resident of Nigeria, which qualifies as a middle-income country, not even a poor country. Or you take a poor country like Mali, the average resident there produces the same amount of carbon in a year as the average British tea kettle. And the impacts are unequal too. Already, according to some estimates, dozens of countries in the global south have lost 20% of their potential GDP due to climate change. And these are not countries that can afford that loss. And they already can't afford to adapt to what's coming. So what worries me as much as the impacts themselves is how we in places like the United States so reflexively tune out news of that suffering elsewhere in the world, such that you may not even have heard of the coup belt that swept across the Sahel in sub-Saharan Africa, over the last few years. 7 countries, 14 coups. You can walk from the Atlantic Ocean to the Red Sea only through countries that have had coups since 2019. And this is part of the world that has long been talked about as the most ecologically unstable, and which has, unfortunately, political institutions that are not capable of responding to ecological disruption. You might not have heard about the devastating drought and famine in southern Africa in recent months, or the lethal heat waves that have hit South Asia now each of the last 3 years. Instead, we look at the suffering of people living elsewhere around the globe and think often, as Americans, we think, oh, that's what life is like over there. That's what it's always been like over there. And I think, unfortunately, we also increasingly think, however bad it gets over there, we can't let those people come here. And you might have thought in the abstract that climate change would teach us a lesson about all of this, about our common humanity, about our shared fate, about how we are responsible for one another, and in this particular case, how Americans are especially responsible for much of the suffering of people in the global south. We're all on this spaceship Earth together, and those of us looking closely know exactly how damaged the ship is. But I worry increasingly that the lesson we've taken is almost the opposite, that even if we know climate change is real, and even if we know that we've been largely responsible, we think instead, well, that's their problem, not ours. So where does that leave us? I would say with an awful lot at stake for an awful lot of people in many parts of the world, and not enough people in places like this one seeing that fact nearly clearly enough. I spoke earlier at the top of my remarks about how much things have changed recently and for the better. And that is all true. The climate future does look a bit more manageable than it used to. Although one way of describing that progress is that the world has landed on a likely future path in which climate change will be difficult but manageable for the wealthy countries of the world and much harder for the global poor. And that's the future that we have effectively chosen. I do think the progress is worth clocking and noting and even celebrating, not just because it's true and not just because it's an antidote to feelings of despair, but ultimately because it reminds us simply how much can change. And that's the point I was really trying to emphasize at the top. What seemed impossible 10 years ago, or even 5 when I was writing my book, is now the path we're on. What seems impossible now may well be the new course 5 or 10 years from now. But that won't just happen just because. We've made the progress we've made, as inadequate as it is, because many millions of people decided to make it happen, to listen to their conscience, to refuse to be silenced, and to take the action that they knew was right. And their voices were heard, and the people who heard them changed. So, what action should all of you take? The students here tonight, but anyone else at any other stage of their life? Of course, that is entirely up to you, each and every one of you. I often say, as a kind of climate storyteller, the story is too big to tell in any one way. You can tell it in apocalyptic terms, you can tell it in optimistic terms, you could tell it in political terms, you could tell it, it's technological terms. And all those stories are true. But the challenge is also too big and complicated to solve in any one way or from any one direction. So that means that everyone has a role, whether it's through politics or social justice or entrepreneurship. The future will be transformed by these forces, by the forces of climate change and the force of what we do to stop climate change. The question is only where in that transformation you stand and what you do. And so I would never presume to stand here and give out directed advice about how to cut your carbon footprint or how to enact your own politics or how to build your own career. I would just say the climate has set the stakes of all of these choices for us. And the lives and well-being of every person on the planet and everyone in the generations to come, to some extent, hangs on those decisions, on our collective decisions, but to some extent, our individual decisions too. And let's not shy away from that privilege. Let's not forget that responsibility. Let's remember how remarkable it is to be alive right now capable of making a happier future and seeing the opportunity for change all around us. So thank you. This is the end of my remarks, and I think we're now going to have some Q&A.
Sorry, guys. Thank you for the insight, Mr. Wallace-Wells. I know we can all walk away inspired to make the world a better place. Good evening, everybody. My name is Mara Wainick. I'm a student here at MCC, and I have the privilege of opening up our Q&A session. I would like to invite anyone with questions to the 2 microphones right up front, but since I'm already at a microphone and I have a question, I'm going to ask it from here. I believe that the climate crisis is definitely an endeavor without a finish line. As we make steps in the right direction, do you have any advice or insight for us on how to stop ourselves from becoming complacent in the progress?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, as with any humanitarian or political challenge, you need to be motivated and mobilized by the opportunity to make things better. And that opportunity will always be in front of us. So, we often talk about climate change. We think about climate change in these binary terms. It's like, can we beat it? Are we doomed? But we're actually not going to be living really in either of those futures. We're going to be living in the muddle in between and determining just how bad and ugly that muddle is and how much opportunity for human flourishing that is. And that means, on some level, we've lost the chance to really secure the future that we might have hoped for, and that's dispiriting. But it also means, the worst outcomes are vanishingly unlikely, and ultimately, that what we owe ourselves and the future is the kind of responsibility that each of us has in our non-climate lives, which is to pay attention to the needs of those around us, to attend to those with less, and to try to do what we can to give them a hand up. And when you're engaged in that work, whether it's as a writer, as an activist, as a someone who's handing out first aid in a disaster zone or whatever, every person you connect with, every person you talk to, is a kind of an incitement and an excitement for future action, because you see in each individual person what it means to make a difference. And I don't, my view of the big picture is like, individual action is very small compared to systemic change, and that can be dispiriting. But as I was saying in my talk, it's also really important to note that even if the systemic change isn't nearly sufficient, it's not happening nearly as fast as we would like, and hasn't produced the outcomes that we might hope for, nevertheless, things are moving. And so on both of those levels, the systemic and the individual, I think, it's a challenge, and we shouldn't beat ourselves up if we fall into some amount of despair, or for that matter, complacency, as you say. But we should just do what we can to be honest in clocking the progress of the world, and use that always as motivation to do more rather than do less. Other questions in the audience? I think there are mics, if you guys want to walk up to the front. Thanks for the question, by the way. Yeah.
Is this on? You can hear me.
I can hear you, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. My name is Natalie. I'm a human services major at MCC. First of all, thank you for your wonderful talk. I think you put a lot into words, what is really hard to say. I did some research a few weeks ago about climate finance and how it is not adequate enough, especially in least developed countries. And I think that today it's hard to bridge the knowledge gap of empathy between us living here in a developed country like America and some of the least developed countries. And I would just ask you, what do you think that we can do to increase that knowledge and empathy of what people are going through in least developed countries? Because from what I found in my research, a lot of least developed countries don't even have the capacity to voice their needs. And it's really disheartening research to do. So again, thank you for doing what you do.
Yeah, I mean, it's in many ways pretty bleak, like the global divides here. You know, one way I think about it, and this may be a little mathy or whatever, but the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, under Joe Biden recently revised what's it called, its social cost of carbon, so that its estimate for the amount of damage that every ton of emitted CO2 does to the world. And they revised it to, it's like $190 a ton, but it's in 2019 dollars, so in present day dollars, it's like $220 a ton. And that means that every year the US is imposing $1 trillion of damage on the world. And that's not some fringe climate group's estimate. It's not one nutty scientist. That is the EPA. That is their official estimate of the amount of climate damage that the US is doing. And if you talk to the people who put together that estimate, they say, you know, actually the US at this point, it's for reasons that we don't need to get into, the US is still to some degree benefiting slightly overall from climate change, which means we're actually imposing on the rest of the world more than $1 trillion in damages. We're getting a little benefit, and we're imposing more than $1 trillion every year in damages on the rest of the world. And at the latest climate conference, we sent an envoy, John Kerry, to celebrate what's called the Loss and Damage Fund, which is this, it's a long fight in the climate geopolitics community to set up a way that poor countries that are being hit hardest can draw resources to rebuild and to protect themselves as a sort of a reparations for the damage that the global north has done. And it was a long fight, and there's been a lot of resistance, and American diplomats always hate the word reparations when we talk about climate. But, you know, it was a major breakthrough that this fund got established, and John Kerry was there to celebrate it. And he brought a donation to the Loss and Damage Fund from the United States, a country that has estimated itself that it's doing $1 trillion in damage a year. And the amount of money that we gave to the Loss and Damage Fund was $17 million. Now, again, I don't want to, a lot of people don't, there are 1,000 millions in a billion, and there are 1,000 billions in a trillion. So we're talking about 1/50,000th the amount of money that the US government itself calculated it owes. Did it come promising? There are literally 5 players on the Boston Celtics making $17 million a year this year. That is the huge gap between what's needed in the global south and what is coming from the global north. It's not nothing. You know, rich countries have pledged $100 billion a year. We haven't gotten that. We're getting close, but it's not in donations. It's like in loans that then they have to pay back, so it's all very complicated. But as we approach that target of $100 billion a year, diplomats from the global south said, actually, we need something more like $500 billion or $1 trillion a year. And we're very, very far from those impacts. So how can we make progress there? I mean, there are 2 basically tracks or areas. One is, practically through multilateral institutions, global climate banks, that kind of thing. And there I think there is some reason for hope. The new head of the World Bank, Ajay Banga, is very focused on the plight of the global south. The presidency of the G20 is being held now by Brazil. Lula, the president of Brazil, is very focused on these issues. I think there's some real chance for some financial reform in the global financial system, particularly as it relates to development. And I think that, it's one of those scenarios where we're not moving nearly fast enough, but there is actual signs that we're moving in the right direction, at least for the first time, maybe ever. On the consciousness-raising side, I think the simple answer is just to keep talking about it and not let yourself tune out the news or to tune it into background noise, and to take seriously the fact that there are now tens of millions of people suffering from acute hunger in Southern Africa who 2 months ago were not, tens of millions of people, because of climate change. Now, these are stories that people in the US don't like to hear. But I think what we can do as people hoping to focus on that plight is to not let the story disappear. Reward media organizations for telling those stories by reading those stories, sharing them, et cetera, and talking about them in our own lives. And that relates to a bigger question and challenge that many people have in dealing with the climate crisis, which is, many more people have climate worries, then talk about them, even with the people they love. Poll after poll shows this. And Americans routinely underestimate how supportive of climate action their fellow Americans are, how much scientists believe in climate change that Americans routinely underestimate. But many more of us are thinking about this and worrying about it than we think. And the best way that we can build alliances and start taking action together is just by opening up to the people around us, being honest about what we're thinking about, what we're worrying about, and hearing what they've been thinking about and worrying about too. And that may sound a little soft and like therapy speak, but the smallest building block of political action is talking. And I think we could all stand to do a lot more talking about the crisis.
Thank you.
My name is John Kastner. I serve on the board of the Rochester Regional Sierra Club. And I have more of a comment than a question, reinforcing your idea that the climate emergency can seem overwhelming, and there's so much and you're so little. I just want to recount a story that I read in the Buddhist journal Tricycle about a person who asked Bill McKibben, a famous climate activist, what's the single most important thing I can do to address climate change? And he said, there's not much you can do by yourself. Join something and make it a part of your life. I've been serving on the board of the Sierra Club, local Sierra Club now for 14 years, and I still have a life. I urge you to find something to join. Don't take this all on yourself. It's not just you, it's all of us.
Yeah, thank you for that. Bill's a great hero of mine and a friend of mine, and I endorse everything that he says, but especially that sentiment. Yeah.
Unfortunately, we do only have time for one more question, but don't be afraid. If you do have questions, you can ask. We are going to have a book signing after this, right out in the lobby. But yeah, so for our final question.
Hello.
Hey.
So I had some thoughts, and I know that my question will craft as I
Yeah.
talk. But you mentioned the EPA, and I'm just thinking about like a lecture that I heard recently from Tyrone Hayes, where he would consistently share his research on the use of atrazine, showing that it lowers testosterone and increases the risk of cancer, and that it exists for generations. His study was on frogs, but like there was a lot of correlation over to human beings as well. And the EPA decidedly ignored that, and I believe there's still atrazine use today. And so I was wondering if you had a thought about knowing how America's contribution is to the impact on the climate. Do you think there needs to be some sort of responsibility held elsewhere outside of America that holds America accountable? And if you have time, if you have any comments on the meat industry and its impact, I'd like to know your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with the second part, which is just to say, I said in my talk, like, I don't presume to tell you how you're going to cut your carbon footprint, but just so you know, if you want to cut your carbon footprint, you stop eating red meat, stop flying, and drive an electric car. Those are the three biggest things you can do. And, the whole thing is not going to be solved through individual action, but if you want to take control of your own life and live within your values, those are the most important tools that are available to all of us. On the other question, in a just world, the U.S. would be held responsible for past carbon emissions. Absolutely. I wrote a piece a couple of years ago called "The Case for Climate Reparations," in which I walked through the math on a lot of this, and it's intimidatingly large. I mean, the U.S. owes, just to this point, based on historical emissions, something like $25 trillion, which is like the size of our GDP. And those effects are actually going to grow over time. There's an interesting area of climate research showing that, you can't freeze a damage in time because since warming continues, the damages continue too. And even if we stayed at a stable climate, it's like if we're at 1.5 for 150 years, that's 150 years of 1.5 degree impacts. Or if we're 2.5 degrees, it's 150 years of 2.5 degree impacts. And so those really add up. the numbers are really, really large. And if you talk to people who are in positions of real power, like, you know, the president or his climate deputies, his climate envoys, they will tell you that we can't talk about that language in the US because it's so alienating. We can't talk about our guilt. People hate, you know, will like immediately turn away. In fact, the whole establishment of that loss and damage fund that I talked about, a lot of that fight was about whether they were going to use the language of climate reparations, whether they were going to use climate damages, or, you know, how it was going to be talked about, because American diplomats at least didn't want to extend the invitation to the global south to blame them for their climate woes. But of course, we are to blame. Exactly where that leaves us going forward, I think is more of a political question than a moral question. I think morally the logic is very clear. But if the question is, how can we best secure support for better livelihoods, more human flourishing, and more climate protection in parts of the world that are being hit hardest and don't have those resources today, personally, I'm somewhat agnostic, and I don't know exactly what the best path forward is. In the world system, as it exists in 2024, I don't think that like establishing a kind of like, you know, international criminal court for climate damages is likely to actually get all that much money from the US. Not to say that I object to it for moral reasons, I support it for moral reasons. But I wonder if this is a more of a like, you know, what's the proverb? Like you get more flies with honey than you get with vinegar. But I do think that as part of that, you know, whether or not like there is an international court holding the US to account, I think that as part of that, we all as citizens need to see more clearly and talk more clearly about the responsibility that we know we have individually and collectively for these impacts. And if we build a larger political coalition that is focused on and unapologetic about that set of facts, maybe it doesn't mean that like the US is going to pay its full climate bill. I think probably that's unlikely in any future. But maybe it means that we do a lot more of what we can to help the global south develop in a green way, to provide them with green infrastructure, to do technology transfer so that the improvements that we've made in solar technology or battery technology can be used freely by the rest of the world rather than licensed for profit. These are things that I think are more on the table. And so I would like to see a sort of political movement focused on our responsibility, not to, you know, lacerate the country and put ourselves on trial, but to do what we can to make sure that the people who have been hurt the most and will be hurt the most can hopefully count on a little bit more help from us than seems likely at this point. So thank you for the great questions. Thank you for coming, everyone in the audience. And we'll be, where am I signing books?
Yeah, out in the lobby. Okay. Thank you again so much for joining us, Mr. Wallace-Wells. I would like to invite all of you to join us in the lobby right out there for a book signing. And thank you all so much for coming, and I hope you drive safely. Thank you so much. That was really amazing. Thank you.